So today we'll be talking about well, we'll be talking about biodiversity. However, we're not going to talk about it as a whole. Instead, we're going to look at a very um, interesting and more specific part of the idea of biodiversity. In that, biodiversity encompasses the variety and variability of life on Earth. We're going to be looking at a more specific part of it. And by this specific part, before I tell you what it is, I just want you to ask yourselves, in biodiversity, what is the strangest thing that happens? Well, personally to me, the strangest thing that happens besides, I guess, evolution, is how different species of organisms like cats, dogs, mice, elephants, lions, people, is how they interact with one another. It's like this strange like wiring in our brains and every living organism's brains to, in one way or another, interact with each other. So you have a person, you have a cat, you have an elephant, you even have other or species as well, up to like mosquitoes as well. Even mosquitoes have this strangeness to interact with each other, not in a good way, mind you, but but a bad interaction is still an interaction. Well, this leads to the next question of why? Why is everything interacting with each other? And everything wants to interact with each other, not so that they can help each other or necessarily screw the other person over or the other species over. It's more or less this instinct to not die out. And I guess the meaning of not dying out is in the name, trying to preserve their species, not die. And so how and so there's many different ways that species work together, but actually just the other day, I saw this magpie that was just brutally attacked by a bunch of other birds of the same species. Not for, and perhaps it was for some very specific reason. Maybe the birds had a vendetta against this magpie. But to me, it just seemed like they were just trying to protect their territory. And so looking at these types of interactions is not only very interesting, but they can actually help us to gain a better understanding of how our world works and how we can obviously take a step to preserve this uniqueness of life. And so and this is the whole idea of species biodiversity. And species diversity looks at why there are different species, and also how these different species interact with one another. And it all forms like this fantastic web of just trying to not die. That's basically it. And more specifically, one of the first one of the obvious things that species try to do to not die is to adapt to their environment. Um, and we know, and everyone knows what adapting to your environment is. You learn in primary school. You learn that if it's cold outside, if it's a cold habitat, there's going to be animals are going to have fur. But how do we actually trace this lineage, I guess, of actually the species actually acquiring fur? We know they're just not randomly born with it. We know that you can't just have a furless wolf that births a wolf that has fur. That doesn't make sense. Instead, they gradually evolve it over time. And this leads to the idea of molecular biodiversity, but more importantly, it actually shows us how different species come to exist. And so the biggest factor of why there are different species is based around their environment. And, for people, we can make what our environment is. We can make it hot, cold, we can move where it is. But obviously, many species, they lack that cognitive ability to actually build houses and build air conditioning. However, there are many species that go this extra mile to change their environment. And what an environment has, more specifically, is that every environment isn't the same. We know this. We know that deserts aren't the same as coral reefs. Obviously, coral reefs, the biggest difference is that they have water, whereas deserts, they just have sand. But this begs a bigger question of, well, if there's so many different environments, how come the fact that there's so many different environments creates so many different species? And this is where we see the link. More specifically, we see that the things that aren't alive in the environment, such as sand, water, minerals, salt, these things, they don't come out of living beings. We don't put them there. Animals don't put them there. They come there by themselves. And obviously this is the term abiotic factors. The factors that aren't inherently biotic, and biotic is just produced by living things. It's just another way of saying living things. And there's so many different abiotic factors. For example, and going back to that desert and coral reef example, deserts, it's very empty. Coral reefs, it's very rich. There's a lot of coral. There's a lot of different fish. There's even sharks, turtles. It's absolutely packed with just new different species. Why? Because it can support so many different species. And so, but the desert, it's not as if the desert is just empty sand. There's tiny insects. There's also sometimes mice, depending on where you're from. And there's obviously the main man, the cacti. cacti still live in deserts, right? They're not dead. But this is important because all of these, I guess, species, these actually lead to how other species interact in species interaction. We have the abiotic factors that lead to having different species. And we also have the biotic factors that lead to how species interact with one another. And for example, obviously, and so we'll look at the coral reefs more specifically. So imagine if you were just a fish. You will be a orange fish. You can be Nemo. And you're just swimming through the coral reefs, enjoying your life, trying not to die, trying to find a mate to reproduce with so that your species does not die. And so you can't just swim in the open. If you swim in the open, you're just easy fish food. So how do you actually not get eaten? Well, you have to obviously use your environment to your own advantage. Now actually, just aside from this point, a big fish that eats a little fish is actually one of these special interactions, and we obviously know it as predation. Prey eats fish, and obviously the prey, us the little fish, we don't want to get eaten. That's a bit awkward. Kind of defeats the purpose of trying not to die. And so how can we actually find a way to stay safe? We can work with our environment. We, the little fish here, we can work with abiotic factors, but also we can work with biotic factors to our own benefit. So for example, we're clownfish. One abiotic factor that we can use to our own advantage is obviously that in coral reefs, the environment that leads to these abiotic factors, they obviously have giant rocks, right? They have giant rocks that we can use to take shelter. We can hide from the big fish here and not die. But maybe there's a smaller fish. Perhaps not a fish, but maybe an eel. Maybe there's an eel that's sly enough to slick through the rocks and actually still be able to kill us and eat us. So not only can we use biotic factors, but we can also use other living creatures to help us. And so if we want to interact with the other living factors of the environment, in this case the coral reef, perhaps we can make a trade-off. Perhaps we can give them something and they can give us something. In this case, we're clownfish, so we obviously want protection. And the species that provides us protection is this strange anemone that has like these very unique tentacles that they've adapted to their environment to not die. They have this special thing that actually shocks living species. And maybe to us, we got lucky and that we're actually immune to this little shock, and so we can hide here. Now, obviously, we can't just stay here rent free. That wouldn't be in our best interests. So, in return for protection, perhaps we can give them some nutrients, such as our fish poop. That might sound a little gross, but every plant loves fish. Every plant, whether it's underwater or on land, they love poo because it gives them nutrients. And so this is an interaction that we refer to in biology as mutualism, when both species mutually benefit. There isn't much else to say about mutualism, but what if we had a situation where perhaps we try to interact with, perhaps we are, instead of a clownfish, perhaps we are a turtle. A majestic turtle gliding through the ocean with grace and beauty. And so, as a turtle, we are just swimming around in the ocean, minding our own business. Perhaps we're eating seagrass as well. But maybe in the seagrass, there is a strange, maybe while swimming actually, a strange piece of plankton sticks onto our shell. And over time, that plankton grows up to become a barnacle, 2 barnacles. The barnacles benefit, obviously, because they get to have free transport around the ocean or the coral reef, and they don't even have to pay anything. And the turtle, this majestic turtle here, he doesn't care. It's not as if he's dying, right? And this is actually what we call commensalism. However, so commensalism is when 2 species interact with each other where one benefits and the other one, such as the turtle, doesn't really gain or lose anything. But we know that over time, a population has to grow. 2 barnacles will eventually become 4 barnacles. 4 barnacles eventually become 8 barnacles. And 8 barnacles, well, it becomes like 16. And eventually, this turtle shell here, it's going to get too crowded. Not only that, it's going to start adding way too much weight onto the turtle, and it's going to make it very challenging for it to swim, which obviously means it's harder for it to free itself from predation. And so at this point, the turtle is actually starting to not benefit, but he's actually starting to get screwed over. And this is not commensalism anymore. Biologists refer to this as amensalism. And amensalism is when two species interacting with one another. One species, such as the barnacle here, they are benefiting, whereas the other species is actually it's not amensalism. The correct term for this would be it would technically, okay, this is when it starts to get complicated. Well, we know that in biology, nothing is ever black and white. And this is just one of the many examples where you can't just give something a label. You can't be sure about whether something is whether interaction is mutual or whether it's commensurable, I guess. It's not always black and white. We know that's not how biology works, because if it was, everything would be a lot more simple, and perhaps society would have advanced by 300 years by now in animal research, I guess. This example with the barnacles, I guess, overriding this total is that the barnacles actually start to become sort of a parasite where it's having a lot of benefit, and at the same time it's screwing over or harming the turtle. And this is the term parasitism or parasitism. Now, the word amensalism that I mentioned before, it's kind of similar. However, the difference is that it's very oddly specific. There's hardly any example where you'd find this interaction, and really, it's when you have a species that when there's two species interacting, where one is not even being benefited, it just exists, and the other one, it doesn't even get any benefit either. It just gets harmed. And I guess one example would be this very specific Australian tree that is affected by this strange root. And this root basically just exists. Obviously roots, or I guess your roots still want to have nutrients to not die. And to do this, unfortunately, they've just chosen this specific tree as their sacrifice. Where they'll get their nutrients from? Well, it's not even really a sacrifice as well. It's more or less they just happen to land there and they just start doing their own thing. So, amensalism is very specific, bit arbitrary. But back to the bigger picture. So we know that species can interact this way. But why is this important? Well, we know that it's important so that species can survive and not die. But it's a very delicate balance. It's usually not just two different species. In fact, you can have multiple species interactions that actually create a chain of one another. So for example, if we had a duck, and let's just say this species of duck likes to eat bugs, ticks, whatever. And strangely enough, there is a boar. Well, actually, yeah, we'll make this a bit more fun. Let's say there's a meerkat. This is very strange. Meerkat. I don't know how to draw a meerkat. This is a meerkat. It's hieroglyphics. And there is a boar. If anyone gets this reference, good on you. But, okay. So this boar, it just exists. It doesn't do anything. But what if this boar had parasites? This first interaction we see is obviously parasitism. This boar is losing nutrients while these parasites just breed, or ticks, I guess, just breed like crazy, and they just start overwhelming. Eventually, over time, the boar is gonna just die because it has no blood. But here comes this meerkat, and it starts to just pluck away at those bugs, because I guess meerkats like to eat bugs. The meerkat gets benefit, the boar gets benefit. This is mutualism. However, there's also an interaction that happens between the meerkat and the ticks. Obviously, the ticks are getting harmed because they are dying, but the meerkat is getting benefit in that they're getting nutrients. So perhaps the interaction between a meerkat and a tick is parasitism, similar to the tick and the boar. And this is where we start to get a little bit complicated, where it's not just this. We can't. It's obviously a meerkat isn't obviously a parasite. We know this. A meerkat's a mammal. It has babies. It gives birth. It doesn't lay eggs. Unless if it does, and I've been misinformed my entire life. But as we can see, it starts to become complicated when multiple species start to interact with one another. But under this giant scope, under these species interactions, this idea of working together in balance. Yes, we know that multiple species can have multiple interactions with one another. But when you think about this on a greater scope, perhaps not in a coral reef, but more in a forest, which we are more familiar with. A forest has hundreds of different species working together. There's eagles trying to eat worms. There's worms that add nutrients to the soil by decomposing dead bodies. Oh, sorry, not dead bodies, dead organic matter. There's trees that provide photosynthesis and energy, providing they grow and they provide fruit for perhaps, I don't know, koala. The eucalyptus provides leaves for the koala, and it becomes this entire system that works together in balance and harmony, and that's what we call symbiosis. The balancing of species interactions. Or at least that's how I like to think about it. That's why I think it's important. And this here is species biodiversity, where you have many different species working together, many species that are basically come from the environments that they grow up in, where obviously we understand evolution. Over time, species start adapting, and through their adaptations, they start interacting to create this balance. And this is just one part. This species diversity is part of the bigger picture of just biodiversity overall, how life maintains itself on Earth. Thank you for listening.